All right, we're gonna just start like our kind of welcome and thank yous, and then we'll like get started with the panel, if that's all right with everyone. So welcome to all of our attendees and panelists. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank everyone who helped make this event possible. So the Gen Ed department and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Department at Harvard, my professor, Michael Bronski, and my TF, Huey Hewitt, who really helped me plan everything here. Thank you to all our panelists here today. And I wanted to thank both the Regan Fund and the Open Gate Fund at Harvard who helped us secure funding for this event, and my moderator.
Okay, so I'm going to first get into a few intros about our panelists. Okay, Jesse McCarthy is assistant professor in the departments of English and of African American Studies at Harvard University. He's the author of the essay collection, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, winner of the 2022 Whitting Award for Nonfiction, and a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award. He recently edited and wrote a new introduction for the Norton Library's 2022 edition of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. His forthcoming work includes Minor Notes, Volume 1, an anthology of African American poetry, which will appear later this year with Penguin Classics, and a monograph, The Blue Period, Black Writing in the Early Cold War, under contract with the University of Chicago Press. Our next speaker, Kai Peterson, grew up in a small South Georgia farming town. His down-to-earth nature comes from the love of his grandma Molly and the support of his mom. Kai loves to stay busy. Even as a child, Kai worked hard to help his family, and in his free time, he volunteered at a local assisted living home in the American Red Cross. When Kai turned 17, hard times hit the family, and he was forced to drop out of school, getting a job to help support his 3 younger siblings. His life was forever changed in 2011 when he fell victim to not only a violent attacker, but also the American justice system. Kai Peterson is a trans advocate who served 9 years in prison for self-defense. During his incarceration, he fought for trans prisoners' rights to medical care. Kai is vibrant, intelligent, and uncommonly kind, with a genuinely loving nature and a passion for promoting human rights and transgender equality. Kai's case draws into sharp relief the ways that racial and gender discrimination make acute the routine lapses in due process, medical negligence, and dehumanization that characterize the U.S. criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex. His story is entrenched in institutionalized discrimination, systemic failures, and the denial of basic human rights. Kai's experiences with the criminal justice system epitomize the complex intersection of contemporary race and gender politics within the prison industrial complex. In 2017, Kai co-founded Freedom Overground with his partner, Pinky Shear. Today, Kai shares a story of courage and perseverance with TGNC communities across the country. And last but not least, our third panelist is Joy James. Joy James is an Ebenezer Fitch Professor of Humanities at Williams College. She's the author of Resisting State Violence, Shadowboxing, Representations of Black Feminist Politics, Transcending the Talented Tenth, and Seeking the Beloved Community. James has published numerous articles on political theory, police, prison and slavery abolition, radicalizing feminisms, diasporic anti-Black racism, and the U.S. politics, and writes on the captive maternal through the lens of the womb of Western theory. Creator of the digital Harriet Tubman Literary Circle at UT Austin, James is editor of The New Abolitionists, Neo-Slave Narratives and Contemporary Prison Writings, Imprisoned Intellectuals, Warfare in the American Homeland, The Angela Davis Reader, and co-editor of The Black Feminist Reader. James's most recent books include In Pursuit of Revolutionary Love, New Bones Abolition, Captive Maternal Agency, and the Afterlife of Erica Gardner, and Contextualizing Angela Davis. And now we're going to ask each speaker if they can give a short kind of background on their personal experience and thoughts about electoral politics, and just anything they'd like to say as an introduction to the topic of U.S. electoral politics. If Dr. McCarthy could go first, if you have any thoughts.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. I'll begin maybe in a slightly disappointing register by saying that I'm not an expert on electoral politics. I'm not a political scientist, so The perspective that I bring to bear is that of a literary scholar, somebody who studies cultural studies, cultural history, intellectual history. With all that being said, I think one of the things that I'm at pains often in my teaching to emphasize to my students when I teach courses that necessarily intersect with issues that confront primarily, I would say, the relationship of African American history specifically to the to our broader national conversation and our understanding about the contemporary moment, our understanding about the nature of the history of the country itself. One of the things that I think I notice is the extent to which folks, I think, really, I think, don't have a sufficiently, I would say, thought through account of what they think electoral politics is supposed to achieve. And one way I think we can think about that is to think about all the very obvious and immediate needs and demands of people on the ground that persistently fail to be addressed, okay? That persistently across different political parties in power at different levels, whether it be at the highest level of the federal executive, you can talk about presidential politics, whether it be at the level of state politics, governors and mayors, whether it be at the level of local politics. The fact of the matter is that, as we speak, there is an ongoing and extremely serious, and this is just to take one small example, right? Extremely serious crisis of publicly available drinking water in Jackson, Mississippi, okay, which is the state capital. And there should be no city, no community anywhere in the country that doesn't have something as basic as that. And we should ask ourselves the question of what it even means to live in a state that cannot find within it the capacity to provide water to its citizens, when this is the state that simultaneously is the wealthiest, most powerful empire on the planet. And I think that's just one example that illustrates, I think, a kind of flagrant contradiction. At a larger level, we can talk about the larger systemic issues that face, in particular, Black communities. You can think about the criminal justice system. You can think about lack of quality employment. You can think about the challenges in access and to securing proper health care and disparate health outcomes. You can think about issues surrounding home equity. I mean, we could go on and on and on and on. And I think fundamentally, we really do urgently need to think about how we produce more robust criticism and critiques of the way politics functions in our country. And one of the ways that it functions is, in my view at least, is a kind of spectacle and a kind of enthusiasm for the kind of horse trading and personal advancement questions around electoral politics. And every cycle we go through, our investments in different campaigns and different protagonists of those campaigns. And it's really shocking to see to what extent underneath the major things that in theory we're voting for, the things that these figures are supposed to address, don't get addressed, don't get changed, and don't improve. So with all that being said, I'm humbled and very happy to be here and be in conversation with Joy and Kai, and I look forward to talking about all these very important issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson.
Okay. Hi. So honestly, I'm very thankful to be here. That's the first thing. Thankful to be invited out because, unlike Joy and Jesse, I do not, I'm not academic. I'm not. But the work that I do, to me, I would say the work that I do in my organization, it kind of encompasses all of this because without someone on the ground working and, fighting for whatever rights and policies that need to be changed, nothing is going to happen. Um, so for me, whenever I do any type of speaking event, I always try to include some of my own context, some of my own story, and to just put it in there in a way that people can understand and see how those things connect. As it was said earlier, I am formerly incarcerated. I'm from the Deep South. So we are pretty much maybe 50 years behind you guys on everything when it comes to policies and all this. So we're behind. And honestly, a lot of people will think that it's because of, people not wanting to get involved. But here where I'm from, everybody is pretty much, if they do vote, they're voting for the people that their parents voted for and their parents voted for, or, down that line, or that party. So for me, I would like to just, to me, it has gave me a lot of time to actually sit and think. And I actually had to study these questions to come up with some answers, honestly, because it was a lot, because I'm not really one of those people that can just go out and say, hey, yeah, this is this and this is that, because that's not my particular area. But when it comes to something of this nature, I would like to, at least put in what I think is the correct thing to say from my point of view. And I know it's going to be totally different from everyone else's, but that's the thing when you get, different people in the same room together, and you could ask them the same question, everyone is going to have a different answer, because we all talk about things or explain things or see things in a different perspective. And that's good to have. So I do want to thank you guys for allowing me to just be on this panel, and hopefully I will learn something both from Joy and Jesse and from you guys. So thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. James.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kai and Jesse. I mean, Kai, we're learning from you as well. And I don't think Jesse and I have T-shirts that say, yay, we're academics on it anywhere in our closets, because intellectuals come from all different zones. So we appreciate all the work here. I would say, I'm going to go back to an event we had last week. And this is an event, it was a roundtable, 4 people, none of them are academics. Samaria Rice, who I worked with in the past, following the police killing of her 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Ohio. Don Wooten, who I had not worked with before, but was grateful to listen to. Don Wooten is the Black nurse who is in the ICE prison camps and was a whistleblower on the so-called wound collector, who is inflicting hysterectomies on undocumented women. And the coercion inside of prisons, which Kai, you know better than anybody else on this call, is not just about the exploitation of labor, but it's also the dishonor and dehumanizing people. So it's like, if you want to shower, if you want food, if you want to be able to call, you're going to go through this procedure. And as a nurse, a Black nurse, she was courageous enough to confront that and to go public with it. And then she lost her job and had to go into hiding because of death threats. And she had to take her 5 children out of school in order to go to hiding, right? The third person is Amanda Wallace, who's a young person in their 20s, and they identify themselves as an African socialist. And all this is tied into electoral politics because I'm going to call them testimonies, right? Or their teachings, kind of gesture to the fact that electoral politics had failed them in all of their capacities of being caretakers, being professionals, whatever that means. But for me, a professional caretaker is the most important person, not because they have degrees, but because it is actually an aspect of devotion. So Amanda Wallace in her 20s is in North Carolina. And she was part of the whole matrix, I'll call it a matrix, around foster care removal. and noted the disproportionality that Black families are no more dysfunctional than white families or Latino families or Latinx or Asian families, but disproportionately Black children are taken out of the homes. And so poverty becomes, right, structured into why you can't get any water, clean water in certain ways in Mississippi, and you couldn't get clean water in Flint, Michigan, and you couldn't get on and on and on, right? The dishonor, the disposability of Black life. So Amanda quit her job and became a whistleblower herself, protested at a Black judge's house, and was arrested under some faux terrorist charge or harassment charge, and all these draconian laws are being used against protesters, as we know from, you know, the creation of the Black Extremity Index through the FBI and Homeland Security when the Black Lives Matter movement was kicking off. The fourth person is Joyce McMillan, who is a mother herself, as is Dawn, as is Samaria Rice. She has 3 surviving children. Joyce McMillan organizes in Harlem, and she organizes for the abolishment, she's an abolition of foster care itself, but she also gives you the numbers. So this is what's structured into the democracy, right? The numbers of salary, or the salary level of CEOs in foster care systems that are funded by the state. And those CEOs make somewhere from $300,000 to $500,000 a year to oversee child removal. So when I asked them the question, knowing that I'm going to speak to all of you tonight, last week, what do you think of electoral politics? None of those 4 very courageous women seem to offer any positive statement. Samaria did mention that, you know, the day before she'd gone to the State of the Union address with Joe Biden, well, not with Joe Biden, but for Joe Biden, at the invitation of her councilwoman. And also she was in the company of Tyree Nichols' mother and the mother of George Floyd, and that the politics were performative. And so since I'm a political theorist, more than the political scientist who does the data about electoral politics, so I think we're all here speaking as civic-minded or ethical people, not as experts in any one area. But electoral politics shape and misshape our lives. And, you know, the way in which you can control police violence, or you do not control it, based on who is the mayor, based on who are your council people, based on who is the president. It's like one reality under Donald Trump. It's a so-called better reality under Joe Biden, but no true delivery around the issues that these 4 women were talking about. And I would also say with Barack Obama, I voted for him, you know, totally high in 2008, refused to vote for him in 2012 for obvious reasons, and maybe they're not obvious here. But the disappointment, at least in presidential politics, is stunning. And if this is supposed to be a trickle-down democracy, where these 4 women who all faced death threats to some degree and had gone into hiding or had to disappear because the law does not work for them, it does not work for our communities. And so electoral politics is not a panacea, you know, or protective intervention against laws that are predatory against Black life. So I'm grateful that you raised the question about the function and the possibilities of electoral politics, because outside of that, they were really talking about marronage, how if it was even possible to separate ourselves from a political system that seemed to be more predatory or opportunistic than ethical.
Okay, thank you so much for all of your insight. So we're gonna just jump right into the first question. Okay, for most of this country's history, Black people have not been able to vote or hold elected public office. This changed briefly during the period of Reconstruction after the abolition of slavery, and then again changed in response to civil rights struggles in the 1960s. We're at a point now in 2023 when many liberal politicians seem to not care about the everyday struggles of many Black communities experiencing poverty, police brutality, underemployment, unemployment, and more. And yet conservatives are still trying to roll back voting rights for Black people. Some activists think we shouldn't put any energy into electoral politics because of the betrayal of Black politicians. Others continue to work on voting rights efforts. Do you come down on one side of that activist debate? Is there room to do both? Or should we prioritize non-electoral forms of activism over electoral efforts, or vice versa? I invite anyone who has any thoughts to respond first. It's a hefty question.
Kai, you want to jump on it?
I was thinking about it. Okay. So in Georgia, we have some of the harshest Black voter suppressions passed. And so I can see why a lot of people, especially like the older Black generation, that don't want to have anything to do with politics. Like when I came home and, everybody was going to vote, and I remember talking to my mom, and she was like, I never voted. One day in my life, I never voted. And I didn't understand why. I was like, you don't want to vote, but then you'll complain about when, they cut stuff off, or when something doesn't happen that you need, or your insurance coverage, it drops because that's a new policy, but you didn't vote. And my mom was just, she explained to me, I don't vote because it doesn't change anything. And that sucks, because you would think that, hey, these people are in a position of power. They're supposed to help the people. But in fact, the system was designed to do exactly what it is doing now. It is designed to keep us down and make us feel less than what we are. And that goes for Black people and people of color. I can't say for every person, but I know for myself and a lot of people within my own community that we lack a lot of access to those places that we would need to be in. And a lot of people don't necessarily see the struggle. They will see, they will see a community and say, oh, well, that's just a bad community. But this is the same community that doesn't have any recreational center, doesn't have any, public libraries, anything for anyone to go to and actually educate themselves. So a lot of the stuff that other states and counties have access to, there's a lot of places that don't, a lot of people that don't have access to it. And so when you have a bunch of people that, are lacking those resources and access to that information, they're not educated enough to make those type of decisions. They're not sure which way they should go because they don't have all of the information in front of them. And I know for myself, in order for me to make a decision on, whether or not to do something, I would like to know what I'm up against. I need to see some numbers. I need to see how things are going. And so take, for instance, and this happened to a Black queer, I can't remember her actual, she was a state official in Georgia, and this was in 2020, Park Cannon. This is a long story, but I'm gonna do my best to make it short, very short. So they were doing something with some bills or something that was going on. She walked out of that room. They locked her out. She knocked on the door to get back in where she was supposed to be. She was arrested and charged with felonies. Even though that happened, she still ran for office again. She's still that same person that is doing that activism work. She has done so much, and it's not just stuff that she has done in office. It was stuff that was done way before she was in office. So I don't want to say too much, but because I don't want to run into my answer for my next question. But at the same time, it's just knowing that even when we lack those certain resources, we are a people that will find a way. This whole country was pretty much built off of our backs. So you can't silence us. But that's what happens so much. They try to silence us. And by suppressing those votes and not allowing us to participate in these activities in these things that are for our own good or that are going to affect us and our livelihood, that's when the problems happen. And one thing I want to say is politics and activism, it all goes hand in hand because you can't have one without the other. More people are comfortable, just doing the groundwork. Some people are more comfortable being out front, in those offices. And when that happens, you just really got to think about what is it that we really want? Like everyone as a whole, not just one particular community or group of people, but as a whole. Because if we're not fighting for it, then it's not going to happen. But the thing is, when you're fighting for something, you have to know what it is you're fighting for and how do you plan on getting that done. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jesse, you called on Kai, so I just called on you.
Thank you. I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I think a lot about one aspect of what you're saying, which I think is so true, which is that on the one hand, the Black community experiences such a high level of alienation from the political process. Okay. Most people have no faith in it. They don't see any reason to be involved. And frankly, from their perspective, that's actually in many ways a rational, deeply informed by experience attitude to hold, given everything that they've known and everything that they've seen, okay? There's a side to Black politics, I think, that's all in this country with a long, deep history. Black folks are very pragmatic, and tend, again, for very good reason, I think, to be to be in many ways actually fairly savvy about our relationship to the political system when we do engage with it. People are often, I think, not under as many illusions as I think some folks would think we are, and often people understand that they're voting for the least worst option that's being offered to them, under a kind of theory that, look, we don't necessarily believe or have confidence that going this way or that way is going to do what we need, or give us what we ought to have, but actually we're trying to prevent a worse outcome, or take the least bad option that's being offered to us. And there's a certain kind of way in which I think the electoral system in particular kind of holds us hostage in that way. And the Black vote is sort of used as a way to kind of threaten, in a way, the community into voting in lockstep with one party, basically on the sense that, look, if you don't vote for us, you're going to be in even worse trouble. We may not deliver for you, but on the other hand, if we'll sort of scare you into saying, if you don't vote for us, you'll have to deal with the other party, and they'll do you even worse. But I think maybe what I just want to say is, and because I just think it's not said enough, is that I think we really need to think about the parties themselves and what they are and what they represent. We have a system in our country where political power is concentrated in this two-party system, and that's not actually, when you think about it, a lot of choice to begin with. Okay, it's actually a very tightly controlled system. It's a very efficient, very powerful system. There's a reason why, in many ways, relative to a lot of other democratic societies, that system is kind of held in place for as long as it has. One of the things that it means, though, is that the party system in this country, by and large, forget by and large, the party system represents the interests of the ruling classes in this country. Okay. Both parties represent those interests first and foremost. There is no daylight between them on the question of interests. Neither party is seriously interested in the working class of America. The Republicans do not care about the working class. The Democrats do not care about the working class. They do not serve the interests of the working class. And you can look at their actions, and you can look at their who funds them to know that this is the case. So that, to me, that's just an empirical matter. And when you realize that, I think we ought to begin to invert the question. That is to say, not simply to fall into the debate of, should we be invested in electoral politics or not invested in electoral politics, but be pointing at the system itself and saying, hey, electoral politics itself is actually, if the parties are forever going to be dominated by interests that are actually counter to the majoritarian democratic interests of the society, then the parties are not only not a solution, but they're actually actively the problem. They're actually the forces that are their job, their function actually in many ways is to prevent working class interests in the United States of America from actually being represented and actually exercising influence on the system. So, I say that to say I don't have an answer of like where I come down on the debate, but I would urge, the students who are listening and who are interested in this question to make sure that they think about framing this question already in those terms. That is to say, asking in the first place what politics is for and how the party system functions to deliver political outcomes for whom? For some people, which therefore means against other people. And once you accept that as an empirical reality, from that standpoint, to think about how you want to move strategically.
Yeah, thanks, Kai. Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so I was taking notes, so I can't go through all the notes. They're like, you'll nod off, and start snoring. But there are some things I think that were really key. And Kai, I did hear of that. I read it in the news, what happened to that elected official. And so when you described it again, I was like, yeah, they were Black. And I'm wondering then if the police who arrested them were predominantly white. And so there is something already in, Jesse brings out class, which is very important. The working class are expendable or hyper exploited, right? And this is why I worked on Bernie Sanders' campaign. I didn't think he was a savior. I thought his democratic socialism was more like FDR. No, I don't have a problem with FDR if everybody gets enough support. But there was a way in which even to talk about a $15 minimum wage became demonized as some form of socialism, right? Which would be anti-capitalism. And so it's going to be anti-Americanism, whatever that might be, which is a mixed bag of labor exploitation, but also its origin stories, right, are embedded in genocide and human trafficking. So this struggle with the electoral political system is also a struggle with the police. I don't see any, which is also a struggle with foster care. I don't see any of these things disconnected from electoral politics because it's an avenue towards leverage, right? So I would never say don't vote, but I would say if you want to vote a third party, do what you think is ethical, right? I think there are fear tactics, as you both pointed out, that keep us corralled in a duopoly, two-party system, which both parties are aligned to capital. And I don't mean like mom and pop shops, as you know, we used to have millionaires because I'm old enough to remember that, right? And now we have a billionaire class. And it's like, wow, what did I nap? Now like the concentration of wealth is because of certain elected officials who eviscerated, the rights of trade unionists, who Clinton allowed these conglomerates to form, who changed the tax codes, right? And so when you get this intense amount of wealth, somebody like Elon Musk, who's like, well, Trump should be back on Twitter or should have a public face, and I don't have problems with white nationalists. I think I'm reading him correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. but you get these personalities, and it almost starts to look like a carnival, like carnival barkers, and they're selling these concepts, make America great again, restoration of whiteness, which is just like white supremacists and Nazis rebranding themselves, right? But always I'm noting that all the speakers here tonight are Black, so I figure there's a theme here. So I'm noting that white supremacy is amplified through electoral politics. And whether Nikki Haley can say and sell this personal narrative, I'm from an immigrant family of South Asia, whatever, she's still aligned with a reactionary party. What we're left with is a party of compromise that will follow the money, give lip service to, we care about poor working class people, people of color, people in detention camps. Where did the 500 babies and children, or was it 1,000? I don't know. Biden's keeping the count now. What did y'all do with those kids that you took from their families in the ICE detention camps? Why is it there pictures? I'm sorry, I'm on a rant. Just give me one more minute. Why are there photos, right, of white men on horseback whipping people from Africa or Haiti who were trying to get in these camps to save their lives? There's a way in which we have Trojan horses running throughout the democracy. So I'll mention a couple and then I'll stop. 13th Amendment. So involuntary servitude is legal in the United States if you've been duly convicted of a crime. And I know you know that guy, right? Also being stripped from the right to vote. So it's not just labor exploitation. We're going to pay you 27 cents an hour, or in California, $1 an hour so you can risk your life to put out forest fires, right? And then when you get out of prison, you can't even be a fireman, right? Because we block you from living in certain places. We block you from employment sectors. 14th Amendment, which was supposed to be something that would stabilize political personhood for the emancipated, right? But with the Citizens United, I mean, the Supreme Court eviscerated it over the years, but the 2010 Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court means that white corporations, 90-something% real corporations with real money are white, headed by white men, they're granted political personhood. So there's unlimited spending in these elections, right? And so people like Max Parthas are going from state to state to try to repeal the 13th Amendment. And I would vote for that. So maybe our power can be more concentrated in local voting than in the electoral. I don't want Trump or DeSantis with his hatred of Black studies and historical fact to be elected president. So I guess I'm going to keep voting for Biden or whoever comes next. But we would have to reimagine the game of electoral politics in order to avoid the Trojan horses that eviscerate what modicum of power we have under this democracy.
Dr. James, that was a wonderful transition to our next question. In the state of Massachusetts, activists are trying again after a failed effort in 2019 to restore voting rights for currently incarcerated people. Prisoners actually had the right to vote in Massachusetts until around 1999, when that right was taken away. So now activists are trying to restore it. Could a policy change like this be considered abolitionist? Do voting rights efforts generally have a role in the abolitionist struggle? Also, if there are any local or state policy efforts you'd like to bring attention to in your responses, please feel free to. And the floor is anyone's.
Okay, so I guess I'll go again. Well, okay, for this one, it's weird because I think it was, I don't even know who was everybody was voting for at the time, but an election came up when I was in prison, and they mentioned something about us having a chance to actually vote. And me, I never voted before. So I thought that was really cool, but it never happened. It was just something they got everybody excited for, and then that was the end of it. But I think that people that are incarcerated should have the right to vote. And the reason why I say that is because in some way, those same laws and policies, it affects each and every person. Because, some of those people are not going to be in that institution for the rest of their life. So they're going to, have to come out and have to, re-enter society and make their standpoint from that moment forward. And I feel like the voting rights do play, a role in the abolition struggle. And the reason why I say that is because when you think about it, slaves couldn't vote. And then the people that are incarcerated, can't vote. And it's just, to me, it's just the new Jim Crow. It's just a different way of putting it. Like, and Dr. Joy, I'm so glad that you mentioned the 13th Amendment, because that's like one of the things that I talk about a lot with my organization, Freedom Overground, because people don't understand by, everything that's in that. Once you break a law and you're sentenced to jail, prison, or whatever, you're working. You're getting nothing from it. And another thing with that, a lot of people don't know, but a lot of prisons and jails and different institutions are owned by these private companies. So they have to, what I feel like needs to happen is they don't need to be owned by those private institutions. And it goes from the people that own it to the medical, all that is owned, is private. So when people go into those institutions, they're not looking at them as people or anything. They're looking at, just another bed, and that's money on that bed. So that bed has to be filled. And who is it filled with mostly? Mostly Black and brown people or people of color. Not saying that other races aren't, incarcerated, but that is, pretty much sums up the prison yards or the jails. And the reason why they do that is because they know as long as they have people filling those bed spaces, that's more people that are not going to be allowed to vote, that are going to have a lot of basic rights taken away from them. A lot of people that are incarcerated not only do they not have the right to vote, but a lot of them cannot get any type of government assistance. A lot of health insurance, it's a lot that comes with it, because you have this one strike against you because you was incarcerated. So they take away all these rights, these basic human rights. And you would think that, okay, we got past this, because we had slavery, got past all that to a point. Not saying that a lot of those acts still don't happen today, because, it's a lot of places that you can go to where you're not going to be treated as a person of color. But it happens. And it's just a thing that sometimes we as people see so much that we don't even notice it on that spectrum. Like, we don't even see it in that light. It's just, oh, it's the norm. But when you think about deprivatizing the prisons and the jails, because once you do that, then who's going to give money to these campaigns? Because that's where a lot of the money comes from these different parties. That's where the money's coming from. It's coming from the prisons and the jails. That's who's funding these people that we are voting for. That's who's funding it. So once you take that money out of their pocket, you take that money from them, and you put that money needs to go back to these communities. These communities need, it needs centers for the kids to go to after school. That's one way to prevent, kids from actually getting in trouble. Give them some mentors, give them something to do. It's a thing to where, and one thing that I like to talk about is just, I always talk about, I want to be done and rid of the police. I really do, because it was a point in time where there was no law. The natives did not have law enforcement. Everything was dealt with within that community. And I feel as if we could do that same thing, but it's going to be things that are going to have to be put in place in order for that to happen, because you can't tear down something and not build something else up in that place. So it's just, let's take the money away from these corporations that are funding these people that are just coming through and wreaking havoc on our community, on the country as a whole. because a lot of the policies and the things that they keep slotting in, people are looking at a lot of these laws and policies as, oh, it only affects that community. Like when they done that with the Roe versus Wade, it just doesn't affect women. If a trans person or non-conforming person is sexually assaulted and they, get pregnant from that, what happened? They don't have they cannot legally go and have an abortion. It should be their choice. So you're taking away people's choices. Like, it's supposed to be a free country, but I don't see any freedom in that. I can't say what I want to say and I can't do what I want to do with my body because you're taking it away. Why? So I don't know. I will go on and on, y'all. So I think I'm gonna stop talking and I'll let somebody else take the floor.
Yeah, Jesse, I'm gonna jump in for a minute, okay? I
No,
know
please do, please do.
but it's really important what you said, right? For people, families who have trans kids, right? This whole, I grew up partly in Texas, so for me, it's like, it's right wing on steroids kind of thing, right? So I just get like, oh yeah, that's what they do in Texas. But these prohibitions in terms of reproductive rights, which are backed by the Supreme Court. So, when Obama left, I think he thought Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. I mean, she got 2 million more votes, I think, than Trump. So we know there's a difference between a direct democracy and a representative democracy. This is a representative democracy. The Electoral College chooses the president. And, I'm going on in a circle. I'll come back to my point, right, about Texas. I mean, for me, again, the dishonor is beyond the vote and beyond the labor exploitation. Thomas Jefferson defeats John Adams in 1800 because of 3/5 clause. So every baby Sally Hemings and anybody else caught on that plantation has for him, right, registers for a Southern aristocrat who is a plantation owner. Disproportionately, at some point, they're dominating the presidency. You have the blue state, red states. The red states are like the deep South in that middle swath, Missouri, all these repressive zones, right? And so when I think about how we had our movements in the 1960s and 70s, and 50 years later, they're being eviscerated, not just reproductive rights, the rights of LGBTQ, of trans people. It's, there was a strategy. This didn't just like come from hell, as a gift, right? I don't know if hell gives gifts or not, but whatever hell does, right? So this was a strategy that was worked on by reactionaries and the Republican Party on how you take back all branches, but also how you create this narrative of victimization, of white grievance, and also this hyper Christian conservatism, which is really Christian nationalism. So I see all of our games, Kai, as you were saying, across the board, but certain groups are being targeted right now. The anti-Blackness is off the register. And also the laws, I think, I don't know how many states, it's not hit the federal level as much, but state by state, these anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans laws are reshaping the whole notion of what are rights, and so I'm really curious about how you think about how we would resist this. And obviously voting is not going to be sufficient because they do more than vote. And some of those people, their people show up, because guns are everywhere, like at polling booths with automatic weapons. And again, if you're from Texas, like, yeah, I've seen this before, but this is not, quote, normal. And so I think there's a level of intimidation to keep people from voting and to acquiesce to very draconian laws that are going to eviscerate civil rights, right? And obviously eviscerate human rights, but in an attempt to reshape democracy in terms of authoritarian phase. Now, some people, I think one of your questions is this fascism? I know Robin Kelly uses that term, Jason Stanley. I'm not quite ready to use that term, but I think the repressive nature of government is becoming full blown. So I'm sorry if I jumped in, but Kai, you kind of made me think of different things all at the same time here.
No, I'm glad you mentioned all of that, Joy. And you also mentioned in the chat the need for campaign finance laws, which I absolutely want to second and put on the table for folks to think about. One thing that I would just say, and I'm noticing, Kai, and Joy, both of you mentioned human rights, and I think that's actually an interesting point, again, to kind of try and to pull back our framework from thinking already in a way that's enmeshed in the way that we're told we're supposed to think about these problems. Okay, which I'm getting to this point about electoralism, and I'm sensitive to the question that the question was in particular about prisons and incarceration, right? I mean, voting rights for incarcerated folks there's a strategic question here that I don't want to lose sight of. I think Florida is going to be absolutely pivotal, and we can talk about Amendment 4 in 2018 and Ron DeSantis's efforts to overturn it, which I'm not even sure what the status of that is. Hopefully, somebody who's more well-informed, Joy, you might know more about this than I do. Certainly, I know folks are working on it, and there's a lot of activism, but Florida is a case in particular where I think we want to be very, watching that like hawks for sure. But even and beyond these immediate contests, there's going to be a lot of noise around 2024. There's going to be a lot of noise around, these issues. But we need to think in a longer term way and in a broader sense about what is acceptable. Okay, what is acceptable to us as people? This is one of my point about human rights. Our prisons are unacceptable. They're immoral as such. Okay, frankly, you could make a case that they're unconstitutional. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and Kai can speak to this much better than I can. The perpetual, the constant and consistent degradation, okay, and disrespect and dishonor that's visited upon incarcerated people is a violation of human rights, of constitutional rights. It's an abomination. In a normal functioning society, nothing would happen. Not any priority, not the funding of any military program, not the funding of any concern. No, nothing would happen until we sorted that out first. How can you even call yourself decent and live in a society that routinely treats people in this way? And at that point, right, we might pull back from the whole language even of rights and talk about human needs. What do we actually need as people? What do we have? What should be the basic standards and expectations, right? What should housing look like for everybody? What should, the basics in terms of your supply of, water, your access to basic healthcare and necessary healthcare. We mentioned reproductive rights and healthcare, right? What are the basics that people need? Then let them live their lives. But how can we even validate? Why should we even accept a state in the first place that so thoroughly disrespects at such a basic level people's human rights and needs, right? So that I don't want us to overly narrowly tailor our concerns. This is to say, obviously, I think voting rights for incarcerated people are extremely important. They're important for strategic reasons, and for those reasons, we should be extremely vigilant and pursue activism. I know there are good folks who are going to do great work on that very narrow question with respect to pivotal places. I'm thinking in particular of Florida, okay? But broader context, we need to think about what politics are for. And one thing I just want to say very quickly on this, because I'm sensitive also to the audience that's here, wherein many of you, I assume, are students and maybe students at Harvard or elsewhere. one thing I would ask you to think about is, is your interest in electoral politics a function in part of your interest in kind of integrating a system that as it were, secures and serves for you a certain kind of a position that seems respectable, right? You're going to go work in this NGO and this sort of thing. This is the kind of sphere within which you come from an elite institution, and therefore you're part of these groups that go and kind of work on these issues, and it's commendable, of course, to have that civic mindedness, and I don't want to take away from that at all, but I also want to urge you to think about some of the things that Kai and that Joy have brought up about the ways in which so many people feel so deeply alienated from the system in the first place, right? Which means that we need to actually attend to the repair and to the broader and deeper things that need to be addressed there, and not simply become overly caught up in, let me go and work on this campaign for this person and work for this organization on this one issue, and that defines my political commitment, or that defines the horizon of where I look for articulating change and what needs to be thoroughly transformed.
Great. Dr. McCarthy, again, a great transition to our next question. Since we're running out of time, I think I'm going to go ahead and skip to our last question. So Angela Davis once said that she would like to see more young people in electoral politics. Do you think today's youth should dedicate more time to electoral politics? If not, what are some of the most useful avenues of activism and political engagement for young people to be involved in?
I'm going to say, I think it's very important, because it's actually, I don't know if I can say all future now because I'm getting a little bit older. I'm not going to say my age, but I'm getting a little bit older. But I actually think it's very important for the youth to actually be involved in politics, because when you look at all the members of Congress and everything, these are older white men, older white women. A lot of the policies and different things that they're changing, they're not even going to be around to see it, to see all of this stuff happen. But it's the younger generation that is going to have to, bear the effects of these policies and changes and different things that are, that are happening right now. So I actually think that, more young people should be involved, on some level with politics, whether it's, the activism work, going to protest marches, whatever it is that they do. But another thing, a lot of the young people now are more on TikTok. They're more on social media versus, being out front, So it's like, it's very important for the younger generation to actually take politics more serious, because a lot of the things that are happening is being passed right under everybody's nose, and no one is noticing it, because they're passing, they're overturning this law, but then they're sliding 2 or 3 right under that people never notice, or even care to know about, because they just don't know this is how it works. And it has been this way for a long time, and it will continue to be that way until there are people put into positions of power that are, willing to go against everybody around them in their decisions to keep things the way they are, that wants to actually make changes. But in order for that to happen, we got to take all of this big corporate money out of politics. We have to take it out, because in order for us to make any of the changes that we want, it's not going to happen, because they have all of that money behind them. That's fueling everything. That's fueling their campaigns, their re-elections. And then they need to be limited to certain amounts that they can serve, a term. And that's for like the smaller set, like for the governors and all. Theirs need to be, you shouldn't be there that long. Okay. I'm sorry. No one should be sitting in office for 20, 40 years. Listen, give somebody else a chance to come in with a new brain that is, had to live under these strict laws and policies and everything that's going on. Give someone else a chance to come in and to just do what they feel is best. because everyone is going to have a different perspective. But if you're 100, whatever, you've been through you was there when slavery was going on. I'm sorry, in my mind, that's where your mind is set at. No one's going to change that. That's my personal opinion. You lived through it, you saw it, you probably liked every minute of it, but give the people a chance to survive, and not just survive, but to strive and to be thriving in this life. But if you continue to take away our only chances at being in positions of power and being in a position to actually change policies and laws that affects everyone, then you're not giving us a fair shot. And I'm one of those people that I can honestly say I came into this world with a 0 chance. And I will say now I'm at a 10% chance because I had to fight every day for what I believe in and what I know to be right. So I feel that the youth need to participate in all of this. They need to get a good understanding. But in order for that to happen, there is going to have to be some type of change to where they say, hey, I can do this. But if they're continually looking and seeing, and all they're seeing is older white men and older white women, and they don't see anyone that looks like them on those boards, then they're not going to want to have anything to do with it, honestly. And that's just my personal opinion.
I want to build on what Kai and Jesse said, right? About the need to struggle, but also the need to have a political imagination that exceeds what's available on the menu. So to go to human rights, right? So we think a lot in terms of civil rights. And also, Kai, I would say it's not just about the presentation of white power or white faces. And I did think of Dianne Feinstein when you mentioned, like, maybe you guys should retire before you turn 90 kind of thing. And I totally agree. But there have been betrayals from the Black Congressional Caucus, right? So decades ago, they were on point, like, what's going on in the community, what do you need? But then, as Jesse has pointed out, and you've pointed out, when the money floods in, it buys loyalty to the corporation, not loyalty to the community. So there's a couple of things I want to say about human rights, right? Because you guys have, you both have kind of triggered that. It reminds me of our inheritance. Like, we have a rich inheritance. We've focused a lot in this hour or so about, like, what's not working, and there's a lot not working, but we also have an inheritance that we could build on. So 1951, the Civil Rights Congress, which was, included Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, Black communists, right, Black socialists, they created this petition, We Charge Genocide, and they walked it to the United Nations about the crimes against Negro humanity in the United States. So the lynching, the labor exploitation, mass incarceration, what we've touched on here. A couple of years later, or the next decade, Malcolm X walked it to the UN again, as a reminder, we are charging genocide. And based on the UN definition of genocide, it's a loss of culture, the removal of children, everything that we talked about earlier, that is within the descriptor. It is not just what happened, in Vietnam with 2 to 3 million dead, because the US wants to do an imperial war there. So if we think on the framework of human rights, I think we link more to international struggles around the globe for democracy, and we could better stabilize this democracy that is not expanding based on ethical principles. I mean, it's shrinking, right? It's contracting to more of an authoritarian form. I want to go back to, you brought up Angela Davis. So the mentor of Angela Davis is Charlene Mitchell. She transitioned last December in her 90s. She was a leader in the Communist Party USA, and she came to Harvard to campaign in 1968 when she was running for president. Michael Zagarelli, I believe I'm messing up his name, who's a young white activist in New York City, was her running mate. So I'm gesturing towards third parties. Autonomous third parties that can be faithful to the needs of the community and that are devoted not to careerism in government, right? But devoted to human rights and civil rights. So in 1980, Angela Davis is going to be the VP. This is when in your queries, right? with Gus Hall, who is the head of the Communist Party USA, and Angela Davis will be the vice president, and they're going to be running against Ronald Reagan. Again, third party, Communist Party against the Republican Party. Now, they didn't seem to care at that moment that Jimmy Carter was going to lose, and he was the closest thing to decency, probably, since you had the Kennedys, who were liberal, but they also did, you know, they helped destabilize Brazil with the military coup. So a liberal American president is still an imperialist, right? 1988, Davis runs again as VP, but this time it's going to be, who is running in 1988? Is it, yeah, it's going to be George H.W. Bush, right? Against Michael Dukakis, who's the governor in Massachusetts. And then they use the Willie Horton ad against him. Like a black, you know, prisoner leaves and rapes a white couple, and, you know, et cetera. It's so, like, again, blackness as beast becomes a trigger. I think human rights could stabilize our narratives, could expand our narratives. And I think third parties are the only ones that would be interested in those narratives or have any kind of fidelity to them. So I'm just merging what Kai and Jesse said, that the convention will not work for us. And, you know, I was saying this before, we had these movements, people got killed in those movements. Thank you, police and FBI, COINTELPRO. Of course, I'm being sardonic, but those movements were decimated by violence from police forces. And then 50 years later, they're decimated by legislation and court rulings. And the only out I can think of is that we reimagine this democracy by having greater choices than that are on the menu.
It's beautifully said, and I'll just connect to that, especially in terms on the question of thinking about heritage and examples that we have. You know, I think, you know, the question was in part about, you know, the youth and young people and what they can do and what they can look to. There are very few, well, actually, I think there are not really any examples that of folks from the civil rights generation that I was able to meet in person. But there was, I completely sort of accidentally, I had the immense good fortune to have the opportunity to attend a seminar with Bob Moses. He's a legendary organizer, okay, in the civil rights movement. If the young folks out there, if you don't know Bob Moses, you need to go look him up, okay? But one thing that I want to say about that is, you know, Bob Moses, you know, was from New York City. He was the son of a janitor, okay? He was really, really smart. He was a math major. You know, he went to Hamilton College, but he saw what was going on. He was radicalized by Ella Baker. And so often in the narrative of the civil rights movement, we focus on the male leaders. We talk about, you know, Martin Luther King and the others around him, but actually the founding kind of spirit and strength and force and that made the movement really possible and forceful was Ella Baker. And she radicalized, you know, Bob Moses, and Bob Moses went down into the South and was doing incredible work, okay, in 63 and 64 on the ground. And one of the things that he was instrumental in doing, not alone by any means, but he played an important and maybe crucial role in strategizing and developing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, okay, which was their attempt, and I can hear him now talking about it, you know, in this seminar and saying, you know, we realized that what we needed to do was scare the hell out of the Democratic Party. And this gets to Joy's point about the third party system. Just the fact of it, it did scare them, right? It did produce a kind of even just the threat of this kind of schism and breaking off was what created certain kinds of leverage in that particular time and place. And it required a lot of guts. It required a lot of sweat and labor and organization on the ground. It required Fannie Lou Hamer. It required a lot of courageous action on the part of a lot of people. And these were young people who were carrying this out for the most part. Okay, these were young people who were putting their lives on the line, their minds on the line, who were thinking outside the box, who were doing things that had never been done before, who were who were risking their lives, and people were murdered, okay, around them. And we need to, I think, when I think about that kind of an example, and here again, we can talk about, both working within the system of electoral politics and outside of it, because Bob Moses, long after the height of the civil rights movement, was working on the Algebra Project, okay, teaching math in Mississippi and bringing teachers down to the Deep South to bring education to folks down there, okay, which is something outside of the whole sphere of electoral politics, that also simultaneously recognizes the state's either unwillingness or inability to bring basic education to folks, okay, and saying, well, I'm not just going to stand by and take that. I'm going to use what I have and work with folks in community to bring my people what they need anyway, right? This is just one example, one person who did all of this as a very, very, very young man, not alone. Thankfully, he had the extraordinary, companionship of some of the most brilliant and talented political minds of that era. I think in particular of the work of Ella Baker. But when you put all of that together, it seems to me that we as Joy was saying, and as Kai has said, we have folks who are doing incredible work within and without the system. Okay, and we have, our tradition has always recognized the limitations. We'll work within the system as we can, and in important ways bring our imagination and our effort and our labor to try and force the system into new orientations, because we recognize that it was not intended and is not intended to work for the people that make up the majority of the country. But we also work outside of it, and we need to support and think about imaginative ways to support the folks who are working outside of the system as well. And I think, it's really it's an all hands on deck across the board emergency situation. And we need to always think about it in those terms, because the situation continues to be an emergency situation in this country. And actually, I think we're historically at a point where one glimmer of hope that I have is that I think there are increasingly layers of the middle classes in this country that these parties typically do sort of cater to, that themselves are starting to realize they too are falling into a kind of precarity. There's a kind of sense that there's such a level of disregard for human life, such a nihilistic tendency. You can think about the gun issue here and rampant gun violence, such a disregard and unwillingness to protect human life in this party that cuts across classes, that people are increasingly open and willing to hear the argument that, hey, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. The system itself has some really rotten elements that are going to require a broader imagination to address than the repeated cycle every 4 years of, no, don't worry about it, just vote for this candidate, just vote for this party, and that will be the solution.
All right. Well, we just wanted to thank you guys so much for all of your time. This has been a really meaningful and insightful conversation. Don't want to keep anyone too much longer, but we just wanted to say thank you so much for all of your contributions tonight.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists for coming. It was such an honor. I mean, I can't say that you all were able to come, and I've been looking forward to it for so long. And again, thank you to Professor Bronski and Huey for helping me so much throughout the planning process, and to our sponsors, the Regan Fund and the Open Gate Fund, who also allowed this event to happen. I'm so grateful to everyone, and what a meaningful discussion today. So thank you all for coming, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Stay well.
You too.